Plan? I think pretty much everybody's here. So I believe we'll go ahead and get started. I said I believe we'll go ahead. So, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third event of this cohort. I think we have one more to go for the summer. And it just occurred to me this morning as I was coming in that I wanted to say for you guys that started when you guys started, you've had to deal with the pandemic the whole time that you've been working on your projects, and so hats off to you for having to deal with that. So I'm going to be very short-winded and let Andrew do most of the talking. I just wanted to say that Andrew ended up coming into my lab after he applied for one of the B positions that I had available for the B project I had going on. And I didn't select Andrew. I selected two people with a B background. But it turned out great for Andrew because we ended up having another assistant available that he then was able to come in on, which allowed him to pursue what he really likes, which isn't bees, it's ants. He really loves ants. So it worked out for the best for him, actually, in terms of like the selected for the bee project. So what I'd like to say about Andrew in particular is that he's very creative. He works very independently. He's also very creative. He came in with two projects that he had come up with on his own, and I thought both of those were super exciting. I was a little bit worried because both species that they focused on were not real common species. So I was all going, oh, let's do both of them. But he was smart, had some guidance from the committee members who said, oh, what do we do? So that's what he did, and it ended up working out really well. Andrew Robertson, this is his presentation.
All right, guys, let's get into this. So today I'll be talking about the main effects on foraging behavior on the in the Florida harvester ant Pogonomyrmex badius, and competition with the red imported fire ant Solenopsis invicta, with which I'm sure we're all familiar. So you can see the timelines designated by the stages of egg to adult for the fire ant. But very first, I will start off just discussing Formicidae, the family of ants, and the Florida harvester ant, then some questions that I came across while studying this species, and the methods I went through to sort of get at those questions. Then I'll present the results and start to introduce this lovely animal right here, the red imported fire ant. Then I'll move into the questions that sort of arose between the two species, the methods I went through to look at how they're interacting, and then I'll conclude with these results and how that all fits into the big picture. So ants have been really focused for their efficiency. King Solomon the Wise said, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no chief officer or ruler, prepares its meat in the summer and gathers its grain in the harvest." Now, this was just a proverb about being efficient, but E.O. Wilson pointed out that studies found this to be true of harvesters in that region. They do collect meat in the summer and grain in the harvest. So let's just talk about ants in general. So the simplest way to define an ant is an obligate, eusocial hymenopteron characterized by a wingless worker caste. So hymenopterans are individuals within the order Hymenoptera, which includes ants, bees, wasps, and sawflies. So you may have heard of this called a velvet ant or a cow killer ant, and it is a wingless hymenopteron, but it is not eusocial and not a real ant. These are insects which are eusocial and characterized by a wingless worker caste, but they're actually more closely related to roaches, so termites are certainly not ants. They also have nests that usually contain a single queen, which produces all of the individuals in that colony. And these queens, depending on the species, can live for decades. They tend to be generalists in their feeding habits. Their diet tends to contain sweets and meats. These carbohydrates can be sort of substituted for grains, and the meats can sometimes be substituted for fungi, but that's their general diet. They're also highly ubiquitous. They occur everywhere from mountains to jungles to grasslands and deserts. And even within these habitats, they can be found nesting in trees, bases of plants, rotting vegetation, and of course, nesting in leaf litter and the soil. It's also a very speciose family, having about 16,000 species, which lends itself to a wide variety of diversity. So although there's a lot to talk about concerning ants, from the leaf cutters, the honeypots, the trap jaws, they're all really, really cool. But today, I'll be talking about the Florida harvester ant here, and of course, the red imported fire ant down here. So let's get into the Florida harvester ant and the genus Pogonomyrmex, which means bearded ant, because they have these little hairs under their mandibles to help them carry anything from grains of sand to seeds or insects. But they're geographically isolated from other Pogonomyrmex. You can see that they are restricted to North and South America and tend to go for drier habitats, except for our species populated over here. They're also polymorphic, which is unique among North American Pogonomyrmex. This means that their workers are characterized by being either a major or a minor. So at the top of the image, we can see a major worker with a head width nearly 4 millimeters, and her sister below with a head width of less than 2 millimeters. So although this is very unique for the species, they haven't found any real difference in foraging ability between the two castes. They also are characterized by decorating their nests with very conspicuous discs of charcoal. This is thought to give them a sort of thermoregulatory advantage, so they can warm up more quickly in the cool mornings in spring or in the cool afternoons of autumn. That also makes it really easy to identify a nest, and it's even a helpful metric for population. In addition to these characteristics, the Florida harvester ant is also an ecosystem engineer. They accomplish this through 3 main mechanisms, the first of which is soil aeration. Here we can see Dr. Walter Schinkel from Florida State standing next to a nest that he excavated. And although there are lots of other ground nesting ant species that can till soil just as well as them, the Florida harvester ant also moves around an average of once a year, meaning that they take all of the individuals, move about a meter away, and dig a whole new nest. The nests that they leave behind are actually enriched with phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen, the pKn numbers you see on garden fertilizer. And in the root bundles near these nests, they found that the mycorrhizal spore density is between 2,000 and 5,000 times greater than in the surrounding soil. So in these ways, the Florida harvester ant is a great soil aerator. They're also a very effective seed predator. They've found that in one nest, they had collected over 2 kilograms of seeds, resulting in over 200,000 individual seeds of a variety of species, allowing the forests that they inhabit to be a little more open and less competitive for plants. And although they're great seed predators, they're not perfect. Here you can see a harvester ant carrying a flower instead, and sometimes they might carry a seed and later drop it off before they get to the nest. And some seeds that are collected are later rejected. Sometimes they're even just left in the former nest as they move away. So these seeds are now usually a good distance from their parents, meaning that they won't have to compete for light, water, or nutrients. Last, I'd like to talk about the phenology of the Florida harvester ant, and I've adapted this graphic from Quapich and Schinkel. But essentially, you can see the proportion of adults that forage throughout the year. So we can see in March, they kind of get started. They hit their peak around midsummer, and they normally finish off late November or December. I also included different generations that are produced throughout the year. In this gold-colored bar, we see the elates. Elates are males or future queen ants that take a lot of resources to raise, and I have their timeline cut off by the nuptial flight. These ants, the males and future queens, will actually fly away and mate and found colonies of their own. Below that, we have the summer-born workers. These are the live fast, die young generation of the Florida harvester ants, unsurprisingly being born in late spring and summer and dying off around the fall. Their autumn-born sisters, by contrast, are very long-lived, showing up, as the name implies, around late summer and autumn, but living about 5 times greater. This, in this paper by Kwapich and Schinkel, was attributed to a special diet, and they considered that insect food would likely be present year-round, but they never really specified what dietary changes allowed these autumn-born workers this exceptional longevity. So that kind of made me wonder, what are you feeding those kids? How are they living so long? So I wanted to know, what are the primary factors that influence diet on a colony scale? And I guess that distance and time of year would be the greatest influences. Distance, unsurprisingly, because if you encounter some food, you're not going to keep looking for that same food item further away. And the time of year, because of that shift in worker longevity that we just looked at. I also wanted to know if diet did have some influence on longevity, or rather, if those workers had something different to eat. And I presume that these long-lived workers would consume more insects to supply them with more fat, to allow them to overwinter, and eventually live 5 times longer than their summer-born sisters. So this species historically ranged from Louisiana to Florida and north to North Carolina. So first I looked at Sandy Hollow. It has that sandy, well-drained soil. It's very evenly spaced, wooded area, and it receives regular burning. All factors that the Florida harvester ant loves. It was the right habitat, but I couldn't find a single nest. So next, I sort of collaborated with Tom Mann from the Mississippi Museum of Natural Science, as well as Ed Moody, the wildlife biologist of DeSoto National Forest. And they supplied me with some sandhill habitats that might be good areas to search for these ants. And I couldn't find them. These ants tended to be too rare. After talking with Tom Mann, I did find that he found up to 4 nests in Mississippi. So they're not gone, but not very good for studying. So if I wanted Florida harvester ants, I was going to have to go to Florida. And so this is my study site over here. The far left, we can see Hammond. This is Blackwater State Forest in Munson, Florida. And it's well-burned, open, sandy forest characterized by mostly pine trees, but some scrub oaks and some winged sumac as well. And here we can see 9 nests. I started with 10, but unfortunately, one of them didn't quite make the cut. And I just want to point out ahead that nests C and A are very close to the road. So was nest B. So here's how I kind of got at these questions of what food do they prefer and what are the effects. So first, I offered 2 kinds of bait along their foraging trail. These ants aren't like fire ants that just seem to appear at one spot in a huge swarm. These have a very discrete foraging trail, kind of in the shape of a trunk, where you can see lots of workers coming and going. These are also very conspicuous and pretty large ants, so finding these foraging trails was usually pretty simple. So for their carbohydrate diet, I offered them seeds in a 1-to-1 or 50-50 ratio of Paspalum notatum and Hordeum vulgare. I did this so that they wouldn't be size limited, with the barley seeds being a little bit larger. I also offered them dried insects, or mealworms, Zophobos moria, as an insect diet. So I would use an electric scale to record the starting mass, an ending mass, and record the foraging duration, just because I didn't want different nests having a few extra minutes to forage and skewing how well they were doing that. So I offered these 2 bait types at 7 grams each on inverted Petri dishes. I had to invert them and press them into the soil because when these ants are carrying food items, they tend to be kind of clumsy. They're not very good climbers. And so they would get stuck on the lip of the dish. So by pressing it down, I could make sure that they could easily access and leave. So I offered these bait items at distances of 1, 2, 5, and 10 meters. And I randomly selected which would go to either side, just in case there's a left-right bias. And I took these measurements from the entrance of their nest, which is indicated by that dark spot. So here's what I found. Again, this is just looking at the seeds. I analyzed seed and insect diet independently because they had a lot of covariance. So let's just take a look at the significant effects. So we can see that distance had a very strong effect, and all the main effects were highly significant. There were some interactions, but you can see that from the low F ratio, these are pretty weak and may have been carried by the overall distance effect. This is pretty similar to what we see with insects as well, except only the main effects loaded, but they were each highly significant. So here we can see the effective distance for both seed and insect collection. In either case, you can see that at 1 meter, they were very likely to gather either food type. And the distances beyond that were not significantly different from each other regarding that collection rate. So taking a look at the variation in nests, here we can see box plots. So recall that at the 2, 5, and 10 meter distances, the average was really low. So that's why we see with seeds, a lot of data points pooling up at the bottom versus insects, which were pretty regularly consumed. So let's take a look at the averages of these data and see what kind of differences show up. With seeds, we can see that it's pretty much uniform across the board. The only real differences are between A and C, and G and H. Recall that A and C were a little bit smaller and near the road. In fact, nest C moved its nest into the road during the study. We can see the same sort of effect happen again regarding insect collection, where A and C are again on the lower aspect. Most of the nests don't vary from each other. And then we have H and J collecting a very high amount in contrast to A and C. So now let's look at seasonality. We can see again that with seeds, the very distant ones are almost never collected. So when it comes to seasonality regarding seeds, they're collected mostly uniformly throughout the year. You can see that almost every date of sampling shares the letter A, meaning they're not significantly different, except for July. In contrast, insect rates in July are among the highest. So I have two reasons that might have played into this. First is the nuptial flights occurring in June and July. During this time, the workers, which tend to be more docile, in fact, I was never bitten or stung by them, they become a little bit defensive or even aggressive. And it's not uncommon for them to attack things much larger than them or even other harvester ants. And so I believe that the typical foragers were low in number following this very aggressive and dangerous time. Additionally, they found that in June and July, this species has the lowest overall fat content of the year, meaning that they'll probably need to stock back up. So I believe that they preferentially selected insects, and as a result of both the low overall worker number and the lowest colony fat content of the year. But looking more closely at insects, we can see that from July to early November, they had a significantly greater intake than when they were getting ready for dormancy, coming out, or even later into spring, almost May. So let's try to remember the phenology of this species. And we can remember that in this period, the autumn-born workers are hatching from their eggs and being reared as larvae. In contrast, we have the summer-born workers receiving a much lower amount of insects, in addition to having to share that with their elates, the future queens, which are going to need to stock up on fat in order to lay the eggs to eventually found colonies of their own. So let's revisit the questions I had earlier. What are the primary factors that influence diet? Well, it looks like season and distance were those primary factors. Distance, unsurprisingly, because of, well, you're going to get the closest food available, and season, as we just saw, had a much more significant effect on insect collection, whereas seeds were mostly gathered regularly throughout the year. And I wanted to see if long-lived workers were raised on a special diet, or if the colony collected some special food while they were being raised. And I found that more insect food is collected in late summer, while these autumn-born workers are developing. So let's visit the red imported fire ant, because I kept thinking I should have encountered these ants a lot closer to Southeastern. And a lot of hypotheses float around that this ant is the cause of their scarcity. So when they were introduced to the US initially, they were preceded by other sympatric species from the Pantanal Delta, from southern Brazil to northern Argentina. These species that preceded them were the black imported fire ant and the globally invasive Argentine ant. The Argentine ant has had such success that it's now found in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the Mediterranean, California, and in each of those regions, you can take an Argentine ant worker and swap it with one from another continent, and they fit right in. However, these ants are now scarce. When the numerous invasions of the red imported fire ant came through Mobile, the other species quickly became scarce. So there's some factor that caused or allowed the red imported fire ant to outcompete species with which it normally coexisted. In fact, it's believed that this previous invasion by the other species sort of softened the area. It sort of shook up the invertebrate community enough for a successful and rapid invasion by the red imported fire ant. In fact, Walter Schinkel, author of The Fire Ants, said if S. invicta constructed monuments, it would surely put a formicid version of the Statue of Liberty on the shores of Mobile Bay. So they've done quite well. In fact, their specific epithet, invicta, which was assigned by Buren in 1972, means the unvanquished or the undefeated because of its resistance against the tremendous effects of our reluctance to invite them in. So how did they get so virulent in the first place? The red imported fire ant is very fast growing. Their colonies can reach about 250,000 individuals in a nest in just 3 years. In contrast to the harvester ants, which at their very greatest have about 10,000 members. They're also very well adapted to warm, wet climates. Whether it's the Pantanal of South America or the Gulf Coast, these ants do exceptionally well. They're also extremely generalist in their nesting and in their diet. So although they're most commonly seen in their quite large soil nest with the big mound on top, they are also not shy about nesting in rotting vegetation underneath logs or bricks, or even in nests that were once occupied by other species. Their diet's very general, but it tends to conform to the sweets and meats diet I discussed earlier. When it comes to meats, they'll tackle animals of almost any size, but tend to go for other invertebrates, mostly spiders or other insects. So ground nesting vertebrate species are even found to be at risk of fire ants. They found that species such as northern bobwhites or least terns are vulnerable, but also larger species like the gopher tortoise or American alligator have lower hatchling survival rates when the nests are invaded by fire ants. So it's not just the invertebrate community that is being impacted. So the insecticides, mainly Mirex, had a really negative effect on our invertebrate community. So Mirex was intended to be a species-specific insecticide, only going for the fire ants. But studies quickly found that essentially all ants were consuming this poison, and because these fire ants are fast-growing, when there was free real estate, fire ants moved in, quickly taking up the land that was once occupied by native species. So around the time that these ants entered and essentially conquered the Gulf Coast, the Florida harvester's western range receded. It started becoming more and more scarce. It's not very clear whether it was caused by the fire ant or the widespread application of Mirex. So I wanted to see why or in what ways is the red imported fire ant affecting the harvester ants? Why couldn't I find it at Sandy Hollow? So first I wanted to ask, is there competition between the two species? And I figured that they would compete, but not eat the harvesters. They found that most of the time, ants have a negative relationship with the red imported fire ant. It's through competition rather than predation. So I figured that they probably do compete, and so I wanted to ask how. And I figured that less food would be collected overall and at shorter distances. It's dangerous to send foragers out when you have fire ants around. So I was doing this at the same time as my previous study, but these 5 nests were treated for fire ants. And here's how I did that. So we can see here, we've got a lovely harvester ant nest with a big charcoal ring. And then there were also fire ants nearby. So I flagged these fire ant nests, and there are normally more nests than flags, so I'd just flag an area. Then I would go back through with a stake and a mallet and drill holes into these fire ant nests. And there tended to be a lot of them. Larger nests had more holes drilled into them. And then I would go back, and I'd brought out about 40 liters of water, which I would then boil and scoop into a smaller container that I could actually carry through the woods without burning myself too badly. And so I would then take this container to the already prepared fire ant nests, and I would apply the water until it was pouring over the sides, indicating that I had more or less cooked the queen, and these fire ants were not going to be an issue for the harvesters. Additionally, I was able to avoid using pesticides so that I could ensure the harvesters were not being affected. And just to reiterate, these were using the same methods as before, with 7 grams each of insect and seed being offered randomly to right or left at the same distances of 1 to 5 and 10 meters. And so here we have our results. And just like last time, I'm going to highlight the significant interactions, or significant effects rather. So we can see that the treatment had a highly significant result, as well as a highly significant interaction with distance. We can see that's true of both seeds and insect bait. And just like last time, the seed count is going to be really low because they don't forage at those larger distances. But in either case, we can see that there is a significant difference between the foraging rates when Solenopsis invicta is present versus when it's absent. So when fire ants are around, they don't get as much work done. So looking at that distance interaction, we can see that they forage less efficiently at essentially all levels, but most notably at 1 meter distances. The remaining distances aren't significantly different from each other. When we look at insect collection, however, we find that 1 meter foraging is not significantly different from 2, 5, or 10 meter foraging when fire ants are around. So going back to those initial questions, do they compete with harvesters? Well, yes. They prevent harvesters from gathering up as much seed and insect bait. when the fire ants are around. And then I also looked for predation. I was taking video recordings of nests while I was out, in addition to just spending time around them. And I couldn't find a single fire ant predation event. The assassin bugs were predators, the spiders were predators, but not the fire ants. So not only do they restrict foraging, but I found that the nearby seeds are foraged less often, and insect foraging rate at 1 meter is not different from greater distances. So let's put all of this into the big picture. So we've established that the harvester ants are ecosystem engineers. They really help their plant community, and in doing so, they make the forest better for the other organisms there. We also found that the red imported fire ants are not going anywhere. They've successfully invaded, and they're here to stay. And these species have been in Florida for over 80 years, and the harvesters are doing okay. But they also haven't recolonized in Mississippi or here in Louisiana. So talking with Tom Mann at the Mississippi Museum of Natural Science, he mentioned that this species is being considered for inclusion on the endangered species list, meaning that it would get special attention, protection, and possibly reintroduction. So if they're trying to incite this sort of environmental replication, they need to bear in mind that fire ants are in fact causing a significant amount of competitive pressure with the harvesters, and efforts should be made to reduce fire ants in the event that harvesters are replaced in their former range. So I'd like to acknowledge a few people to which I'm grateful. Of course, my committee members, Janice, Teague, and Beachy. As Janice pointed out, this is not a typical study from her lab, and I was very grateful to receive that amount of freedom. Teague especially helped cut down from my original proposal with the 2 ideas. The second idea, of course, being a bit too much for a master's degree, and he correctly pointed that out. So I was able to shave that down, in addition to his efforts making me a better writer. I'd also like to thank Beachy for just being overall supportive of this experiment, and for always talking to me about E.O. Wilson and all the cool stuff he's done. I'd also like to thank Tom Mann for his correspondence. He helped me with my experimental design. In addition to locating these harvesters, he's been very helpful in a lot of ways. I'd also like to especially thank my fellow grad students, graduated and present, especially the ones that helped me in the lab, Elizabeth, Nick, and Ari. So in total, there were 504 dishes to pick fire ants and soil and leaves out of, and they helped trim that number down, so I'm very grateful. For my friend Walker Mims for helping me boil fire ants in July, and if you want to know what that was like, boil, fire, and July are all in the same sentence. And lastly, I'd like to thank Dr. Walter Schinkel from Florida State, author of The Fire Ants, for his decades of research going into harvester ant and fire ant biology. He's done a tremendous amount of work, and my project would not have been possible without that. And with that, I'd like to open the floor for questions.
Questions?
Did you pull those non-significant effects to get more power?
I ran a lot of different models. And, yeah, when I remove the insignificant effects, it becomes a lot stronger.
Killing them, or the fire ants just simply more efficient harvesting ants, so don't have to say
So they have very different strategies, and the fire ants are actually really specialized at this. So from their subterranean nests, they have tunnels radiating out where they have about a third of their workers lying in wait at the end of these tunnels. And then they have little scout workers that search around for food and recruit the awaiting foragers to quickly surround and defend the food. They spend a long time cutting it into pieces for the other workers to bring it back to the nest. So they're very defensive once they locate that. So when these two species interacted, the fire ants would quickly recruit to the insect bait, and anytime a harvester came, they were attacked. The harvesters were much larger, so they were able to get away each time, but it prevented them from foraging. The harvesters being a little more common and just sending workers from the nest to go grab stuff.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, Soren?
After boiling the nest, you notice that after a while, did fire ants come back and like decolonize that nest?
So that kind of plays into the time of year that I chose to remove these ants. It took a long time to remove them. Sometimes for treating one harvester ant nest, it would take over 100 liters of water. So I tried my best, and fire ants are fire ants. Sometimes they were found in the areas that I tried to exclude them, but it was noticeable with maybe 10 to 15 fire ant workers being found in a dish from the excluded areas versus the 200 or 300 that I would find in the, I guess, control groups. Yeah. Sometimes you get ants, but I would use baby powder. And while I'm hammering the steak, it's vibrating a lot and knocking a lot of the fire ants off. So I would just slap as much baby powder onto my boots as I could and onto the steak as well. But you get it. Yeah.
I understand what you're saying. You have a lot of fire ants on your baits. So how do you distinguish your harvest grains or foraging when you're doing your balance?
Right.
Toward grains versus fire ants?
So at first I was pretty worried about getting evidence of harvesters foraging when really it was the fire ants eating the food. But the fire ants, so these mealworms are, I guess, what you would get at the pet store or for chickens or whatever. And so they're pretty large for a fire ant to carry. And so they'll have to cut them into little tiny flakes. And the bait was only left out there usually around an hour, usually less than 2 hours. And so the fire ants weren't as effective. They were more effective at defending the bait, but they weren't as efficient when it came to actually collecting it. The harvesters being a little bit larger, you can see they're even able to pick up individual grains of barley. So those mealworms were a quick grab for them in contrast to the fire ants. Yeah. So I've seen that in other papers that have tried to remove only fire ants. It seems to be the best kind of species-specific sort of elimination strategy. And kind of to the benefit of that fire ant, you'll know when you come across a fire ant nest, if you just kind of kick it, they're everywhere. So it was easy to kind of distinguish between fire ants and other native ants. Yeah.
So when you establish these transects, the baits of various distances, these just consist of one bait.
So seeds and insects were offered side by side along that foraging trail. So they were the same distance from the nest, and they were both along the trail, but they were in separate dishes, so that it wasn't, if the fire ants were defending the insect bait, it wouldn't, I guess, bleed over as much into the seed bait. All right. Do we have any questions online? Oh, sorry.
So when you're putting the baits out, are you always putting them in like the same spot for the same nest, or are you like kind of?
I would see whatever the foraging trail was going, because they tend not to forage in other directions. So sometimes the direction of the foraging trail would change, and so I'd make note of that and adjust the direction of the bait accordingly. All right. So I don't think we have any online either. Well, thanks, guys.